Okay, now it gives me great pleasure to welcome Dr. Eddie French up to the podium. I find it hard to believe that you don't all know Eddie, but just in case, I have a quick biog I'll read through. So Eddie French is an independent pharmaceutical consultant who specialises in drug product design and development. So he supports medicine development programs in biotechs, established pharma, and various other organisations to design, develop, and manufacture products for clinical trials and the marketplace. He's got a PhD in drug delivery and spent time as an academic at the University of Bath prior to spending the last 30 years in the pharmaceutical industry. So Eddie, and I was delighted to work with Eddie at Pfizer. So Eddie spent a number of years at Pfizer. 7 years he was running their biological programs there and ended up as the director of device-enabled drug delivery. So since then, Eddie has worked on a variety of inhaled and nasal products for a wide variety of organizations in an consultant role. So Eddie, I think basically you know just about everything and everyone. So with that, over to you.
No pressure then. So thank you very much to the organising committee for inviting me to talk. This is a small piece of work which we undertook to try and look at how you'd scale doses from an adult dose to a paediatric dose for a formulation for a drug that's to be used in cystic fibrosis. So this is work on behalf of a company called a British biotech called Enterprise Therapeutics, who has this novel compound ETD-001, and the work was undertaken at Intertech Labs under the guise of Sam Heath and Tom Moody. So just to reorientate people with cystic fibrosis, there's been many mentions of mucus in here. Mucus, this time of year, there is sometimes many people have more mucus than they want, but just to remind you, mucus is actually a good thing. So in a healthy airway, inside mucus there captures noxious particles and removes them from the airway. So the mucociliary clearance aspect allows them to be taken away and swept away from the lungs. In cystic fibrosis, on the right-hand side as you look at it, what happens is there's an iron imbalance caused by the impact on calcium and potassium channel function. That then leads to an osmotic dehydration of the mucus, and the mucus then thickens. It then won't be able to be transported by the mucociliary clearance, so what we've got on the left is good mucus, and on the right side, bad mucus, effectively. So what does the drug do? So ETD-001 is an epithelial sodium channel blocker, known as an ENaC inhibitor. So what that does is it blocks the sodium channel. That means you get an increase in the number of sodium ions in the mucus. That then reverses that osmotic potential and draws water out of the mucosa into the mucus, thus thinning it and allowing it to be transported away. So this is the drug with first-in-class potential, suitable for all CF patients. Potent novel structure and aim to be lung-retained. So just the final structure on the final slide on the drug. So it's formulated as a simple sterile solution for nebulization. It's delivered by the Paedi-eFlow for investigational drug products. So that's like a Paedi-eFlow Rapid, but with different mesh and different front chamber. A very nice picture there provided for me by Paedi, so thank you for that, Michael. It's a very high efficiency nebulizer, which means short nebulization times, and also the eFlow is well used within this CF community. So the CF Foundation like things in this type of device where people recognize the use, and it means they can use the human factors interaction is very consistent. So the drug's completed a successful phase 1 study. So we've got safety and toleration data. It's extremely well tolerated across all doses. And interestingly, it's got very linear PK with nominal dose. So that shows consistent delivery with strength from the device and means it's quite easy to scale the device versus the nominal dose versus the respired or targeted lung dose for what you've got. So we're targeting a phase clinical study for a proof of concept in 2023. Now, alongside that, when you get to that sort of stage of development, in an ideal world, you'll be filing what's called a paediatric investigational plan. So that CF is a drug that's very relevant to children as well as adults. So you're expected to try and develop a utilization of the drug in the paediatric population going forward. And it comes with certain advantages in terms of what the regulatory agencies provide you, but also that there's a sort of a moral responsibility if you're developing a new drug with an aspect that it can be utilized in all areas of the population. So it's a solution formulation, so we don't have to develop anything special in terms of the formulation type to be used in the paediatric group. However, there's a need to devise a suitable prospective dose scaling regime for the age groups, and paediatrics run down in certain different age groups. So anybody below 18 is classified as paediatrics. So 12 to 18 category, then there's 6 to 12, 2 to 6, and below 2 are different sort of categories. And you normally, when you do clinical trials, you structure and work down through those age groups in that reverse order, due to the fact that as you get to the younger age groups, the metabolic processes are less defined, clearance is less defined, utilization of the device, etc. So you want to be able to get control as you run down through those age groups. So this is a very simple study just to try and do an in vitro assessment of the scaling. And as Ronan McLaughlin said yesterday, it gives you a rough estimate. It doesn't give you a precise number, and you can't say, this is the dose. But what it does is when you're going into those clinical studies, it means you're in the right ballpark. And the reason why you want to do that is you want to really avoid potential overdose. So your toxicology studies are all done in adult animals. You've exposed only adults in the early clinical studies, so you don't want to overdose. You want to get the scaling right so you get efficacy, but also then not overdose. So for many oral drugs, you'd scale on a mg per kg basis, or you could scale via lung surface area, but none of those take into account the delivery efficiency of the drug. So we've taken a very simple study to look at that using standard nebulization, delivered dose, and APSD techniques to try and get an idea of the relative scaling of the adult dose to the pediatric dose. So there are 3 parameters that we looked at. There's the delivered dose, and that's the impact of the breathing profile. So children and babies, neonates, etc., they have a very different breathing profile to an adult, and I'll explain that on the next slide. So for that, we used the Copley breathing simulator and a capture filter between the nebulizer and the breath simulator to capture the delivered dose, and this is as per USP Pharmua methods. We looked at delivered dose, and that is in terms of impact of face mask. So children down to 6 should be quite able to use just the handheld mouthpiece for the inhaler. But below that, you're probably going to be looking at a face mask. So is a face mask going to impact your delivery efficiency? And then the last aspect we looked at is the impact of the throat size. So we used the Alberta small and large throat, and idealized throat versus what is the standard USP throat, to see whether that throat geometry is going to have any impact on what we're delivering. So just in terms of breathing profiles, difference between adult, child, and infant, as you look across, the key things are you get a slight difference in frequency of breathing, you get a difference in the I to E ratio, that's the inhalation versus exhale ratio, adult 1:1, breathe in, breathe out. A neonate will breathe in 1:3, so it's 1 breath in, 3 out. Very different in terms of profile and time doing it. We looked at something called face model, which I'll explain in a moment. And then for adult and child, we use the mouthpiece only. And then for the infant and the neonate, we use the smart mask system that Parry have. So, delivered dose. If we look at the breathing profile, actually when on breathing profile alone and the captured delivered dose, there's very little impact in the difference between adult, child, and a slight decrease with the infant. However, when you get to the neonate, with that 1:3 profile, you get actually quite a large drop. You're losing around 30% of your drug in the breathing profile, and that means more of it is actually being held up in the device itself because it's being pushed back. These are the baby faces. They have peelable off skins. It's kind of like Chucky meets pharmaceutical science. They're quite scary, but they're extremely useful. So that's representative of the face. You hold the face mask on there, capture filter in the back, just as you can see, and then that's attached to the breathing simulator. So this is the impact of the face mask. So when you go from an infant profile using the mouthpiece to the infant breathing profile using the face mask, you get a 3-fold reduction. And that is basically the deposition of the drug onto the face and into the face mask itself. So there's a lot of surface losses seen there, and that is then, it's the same ratio between mouthpiece and face mask in the neonate, but of course it's a lower dose to start with. So you see a bigger impaction. The last thing we looked at, throat time, so there's a USP throat on the left, then working across the small Alberta throat, the large Alberta standardized throat. That was attached to an NGI, as in the picture on the right, and the nebulizer input via an adapter and flown through the throat, and we looked at APSD from generated aerosols. This was all run at a standard dose. So these are the APSD profiles that you get from that. You can see that the adult USP and the large Alberta throat are relatively the same. However, when you get to the smaller geometry throat size of the child throat, you get a large amount of retention in the throat, and that consequently means a reduction in stages 2, 3, 4, and 5, which is the sort of the center lung targeting area. Interestingly, if you look down at the very fine particle end, there's no difference, which is what you'd expect. It's just a narrower throat. And that's probably going to be exacerbated greater than this with the smaller general airways of a child as well, not just the throat, that everything's reduced. And I think that was talked about when we talked about nasal and animal tox on Wednesday. So you come to the final thing, the sort of the potential doses that we can look at. So this is the relative proportions of efficiency that you see from using the Parry inhaler and our formulation with the different things. So if you look at the USP throat, far left, adult throat, these are calculated lung doses, or not, what would represent a lung dose, because it's not truly a lung dose, obviously, and the percentage efficiency from nominal dose. So it's very good, and with the device and an adult breathing cycle and that, you're at sort of a 43% efficiency of output from nominal dose to what could hit the lung. As you look through a child, that, as I say, that's relatively the same. If you use a smaller throat size, you get losses if you apply that to that. However, once you get down to the infant and the baby, what you're seeing is you get a huge reduction in the delivery efficiency when you multiply together the delivered dose, the impact of the face mask, and the impact of the throat. So when you come down to that bottom right figure, you're only getting roughly a 7% delivery efficiency compared to an adult dose, which would receive 43%. So how do you scale those two? And in terms of the nominal dose that you're looking. And actually, once you start doing the figures, it comes out quite interestingly that, you know, the largest impacts the face mask, then the breathing profile. You also get something in the geometry of the throat. But from the infant, there's a 4-fold reduction for the baby and a 6.5-fold for the neonate, for the infant, 6.5 for the reduction, compared to the same nominal dose. So if you go in and dose the same nominal dose to an adult as you would to a neonate, you get roughly a mg per kg translation automatically come out, built in via the delivery efficiency. So if we had, as we originally thought, and some of the clinicians were suggesting, reduced the dose on a mg per kg basis going into the nebulizer, we'd have been chronically underdosing by a factor of 6 to the child. And this is probably an overestimation of the dose that you get, because it doesn't take into account the position of the ability to hold the face, the breathing. This is a best case scenario, almost, that the filter will overcapture, as Ronan talked about yesterday, and also it's a stainless steel transit apparatus that doesn't wriggle about. Final comment is this is a very rough piece of work. I mean, it's a very nice study, and very grateful to the people of Intertech for undertaking it for us, but it's still just an estimation. And once you've refined the dose and refined the process, you'd want to go through it again. And also, in an ideal world, you'd look at a specialized mesh within the nebulizer that generated smaller particles for going into a child. Commercially, that becomes an interesting challenge. So it's just a balance of that, what is commercially ideal, launching 2 products, versus what is practical and in terms of scaling dose. Willing to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Eddie. Have we got any questions from the floor?
Just perhaps while people are lining up. Eddie, oh, hello. I thought that was really interesting, and it was the sort of the magnitude of the difference was rather horrifying. But of course, when you did the face masks with the infant and the baby, that assumes, I guess, the perfect fit, because you had an operator holding. In real life, as you've already said, with wriggling and movement and imperfect fit, that discrepancy is likely to be a lot bigger. Yes,
and I mean, I've had discussions with Ronan and John Pritchard of this over a number of years about this, and you know, that they normally, as Ronan was yesterday, talking about the ventilated situation again, which is a still patient. Once you get an active small baby, I don't know if anyone has ever tried to hold a face mask on a small wriggling sputum-filled child, But not easy to keep that going, not easy to concentrate on everything else. And as I say, this is probably the top end of it. So your delivery efficiency could be down as, I've seen figures as low as 1% efficiency, and if you're at 40% for that's a huge dose change. So just in terms of the starting point for the clinical trials, you have to estimate where you were. As has been said numerous times, the variability in the patient is going to be far, far more than the variability we see from the dosage form.
Thank you. Okay, question? Martin.
Thank you. So, Martin Oliver, Pulmacent. Nice talk, Eddie. Thank you for showing the problem. But is the problem really here the way the dose is labelled on the product? When you talk about nominal dose being the amount going into the nebulizer versus actually what we all know, which is the dose that is getting into the lungs, and the way that that is labelled or recognised by the regulators and the physicians to a certain extent?
So that's an interesting question. So on the product labelling for a nebulized product, you will have nominal dose. You will also have delivered dose, but the delivered dose stated under very specific conditions. So if you look at a recently, I think Mylan had a product, an M3 nebulized product, which is one of the most recent approved ones I've seen. If you look at that, it's got the nominal dose, it's got the delivered dose, but it specifies the exact in vitro conditions that have been utilized for doing that. There is no extension of that to a child dose level of that, and that's because the product is normally only approved in its first time out for the adult, so that's going to be the labelling. I mean, you would have to then have secondary labelling for paediatric utilization, which would show very different figures. And the complication with that is it then becomes very confusing. So do you have one product that fits all, which is commercially what you want to be chucking out of your plant? Or do you make... I mean, the paediatric population for most drugs is still very, very small, even in CF. And it's transient. As people grow, they move out of that phase. So to label a product specifically that is always a commercial challenge. And I think you're right. The labelling has become more clear over the last few years with the insistence of putting emitted dose or delivered dose. But still, there's a massive understanding of what people understand as dose, even within the industry. You go and talk to an industry clinician, most of them don't know the difference between nominal dose, delivered dose, emitted dose, lung dose, fine particle dose. You have to do and that's enough confusion to start with, let alone amongst the general population. So I think you're right.
Thank you.
I think that was an excellent presentation. Thank you, Eddie. Okay, we'll move on.